Have you ever wondered, when buying a used graphics card, how much VRAM you should be looking at? And by used here, I kind of mean a graphics card, say 5 years old, 6 years old. So you're looking at 1060s, 1070s, RX 580s, RX 570s, and maybe some of NVIDIA's RTX 20 series. So for these older cards, how much VRAM do you need in a world where everyone says 8 gigs isn't enough anymore? Well, in this video, we're going to take a look. Let's roll that title. Today we're going to be taking a look at 4 cards: an RX 460 with 2GB of VRAM, an RX 570 with 4GB of VRAM, a GTX 1060 with 6GB of VRAM, and a GTX 1070 with 8GB of VRAM. And I think, to be honest, we can just jump straight into the benchmarks, and I'll explain to you how this is going to work. So, on screen, you're seeing gameplay of Fortnite from the RX 460. Now, this has 2GB of VRAM, and even with Fortnite, we're hitting that limit. But how are we going to compare these cards so it's a bit fair? Well, I'm kind of grouping them in 3 ways. The RX 460 2GB, we're going to be aiming for 720p low settings. Well, that's what Fortnite's running in. It's the only game we're going to test with that card today. The RX 570 4GB is going to be aiming for 1080p low settings, along with the GTX 1060 6GB, which is also going to be aiming for those settings. And then the GTX 1070 with its 8GB of VRAM, there we're going to be aiming for 1080p high. Now, I've done that because realistically, that's the settings in modern games anyway that you're going to be running with these cards. The 1060 and 570 fall roughly into the same ballpark of performance. The 1070 is obviously above those two, and the RX 460 is quite significantly behind in performance. So, as you're seeing now, we're just running Fortnite, and this is at 720p with, I think it's actually got TSR enabled at medium, and well, we're already hitting that 2GB VRAM buffer pretty much. Just as an aside today, we're going to be using the Cheap PC channel Test PC of Righteousness with its Ryzen 7 9700X and 32GB of DDR5. So all these graphics cards are not going to be CPU bottlenecked in any way, and we're letting them stretch their legs. So I guess, I know I'm only running one game with the RX 460, but for esports titles it's alright, but you're still going to be hitting that 2GB VRAM limit, even in esport titles running at 720p on pretty much the lowest settings, other than Fortnite here, which we have running with epic view distance. Everything else is on its lowest. So I could have enabled the performance mode in Fortnite, but I thought that's not really fair because I'm not going to be using it on any of the other cards. And I wanted to keep some parts the same, so they're all going to be running in DX12 in all the games that support that. So yeah, I think that's a good end for the RX 460. I mean, it's ending where it started pretty much, but 2GB of VRAM in 2026, you should avoid pretty much unilaterally on any card. It doesn't matter how the card performs, how much brute raw power the card has, the 2GB of VRAM is probably going to be the limit in any game that's, well, released relatively recently. Just in post, I thought I'd go back and actually test another game. So I grabbed the RX 460, shoved it back in the PC, and here we loaded up Red Dead Redemption 2. Now, I'm not going to lie, this kind of surprised me that it even ran, but at 720p low settings, I mean, I don't know why I was surprised we are running in 720p. We were hitting the 2GB of VRAM buffer, but we were getting around 40, 45 frames per second in the gameplay, which kind of surprised me, to be honest. It was a pretty decent showing for the old and relatively slow RX 460. So yeah, that was quite surprising. It doesn't detract from any of the results, and I still would try and steer clear from 2GB cards, but if you are really, really scraping and you just want a graphics card, maybe as a display adapter, just while you wait to get a better model, it might work if you're alright with running at 720p. So here now we have Fortnite running on our RX 570 4GB. Throughout this run, we saw VRAM peak about 3.4GB, and overall, we had a pretty good margin between the VRAM limit and what we were running at. So 1080p, competitive settings again here with TSR medium enabled, and yeah, pretty solid showing for the RX 570. It's no surprise that we're under the VRAM limit. After all, this is Fortnite. But, you know, I set out that the RX 570 needed to run everything in 1080p low to pass without hitting its VRAM buffer. And, well, here we go. It's running Fortnite pretty smoothly. To be honest, it's actually using more VRAM than I thought it would. I guess Fortnite really has started to become quite a demanding game with its recent updates. I mean, I say recent, I'm like going back to 2020 when I used to play it, and it'd use like, I don't know, well, no, that would have been 2019 or 2018, whenever it first came out, when it used to use maybe like a gigabyte of VRAM to run at 1080p at decent settings. It was, oh, I make myself feel old sometimes. Anyway, let's move on as I sit here depressed over feeling ancient. So the second game we've got up for the RX 570 is Red Dead Redemption 2. Another comparison here between it and the RX 460. Here we do see the VRAM pretty close to our 4GB limit. It hits 3.9 gigabytes at some points in our little run through the intro of the game. And yeah, I think in 2026, 4 gigabytes, you can get away with it running at 1080p low settings. And to be honest, I'm not sure if you'd get too much more out of an RX 570 8GB, like comparatively performance-wise. But just to err on the safe side, I'd say if there isn't too much of a price delta and you're all right stepping up by, what, £10 maybe? $10? Then I don't see much argument to stick with the 4 gigabyte model here. You are probably limiting yourself in some way by getting it. And, well, yeah. Overall, though, I think we can say that the RX 570 in Red Dead Redemption 2, anyway, running at the 1080p low settings, is okay. It wasn't stuttery. It ran quite smoothly. We saw around 50 frames per second. So again, a decent step up from the RX 460, and there wasn't really anything to complain about, to be honest. So yeah. So the penultimate game here for our RX 570 is Hogwarts Legacy. So again, 1080p, low settings, and depending on the area here, we were basically at the VRAM limit. You could, if you were flying around on the broom, you pretty much were maxing out VRAM and it would go quite choppy. I don't think I've actually got a clip of... No, I do have a flying around clip in the video, but this is the first game out of any of the games we tested where it did actually get decently choppy, probably because we were at the VRAM limit here. So yeah, I'd say this is definitely the divider game here. I mean, it's a more modern title than Red Dead Redemption 2 or Fortnite, and it shows it, yeah. VRAM-wise, it definitely needs more than 4 gigabytes. But I guess if you're only getting 40 frames per second anyway in an RX 570, I'm not actually sure if you'd be running this game, and maybe using something like FSR could take some strain off the VRAM. So it's a 50-50 here. Again, I would say I wouldn't be playing at 1080p on this 4 gigabyte card. Even at the lower settings, it's pretty rough. But if you use FSR and you're all right with that, then you could possibly get away with it. It wouldn't be the best experience ever, but you could get away with it. I guess it really is a decision you have to make rather than me sitting here judging it. So the last game up for the RX 570 is Last of Us Part 1. Now, this is probably the most VRAM intensive game I'm going to have up today. And yeah, no surprises here. We were at the 4 gigabyte limit as soon as anything started loading in. Now, I have only got a short clip here, but as you progressed through, well, this is actually the final bit of the game here, it went, again, quite choppy, quite similarly to Hogwarts Legacy. And yeah, I mean, we were only getting around 35, 36 frames per second anyway here, so I think the RX 570 in Last of Us Part 1 is kind of showing its age at this point. And to be honest, as a person that played quite a lot of games on console for quite a few years, the 30 FPS thing doesn't upset me too much. But Last of Us is normally quite a pretty game, and it looks pretty rough. It's not running very well. I just wouldn't be playing this on an RX 570 anymore, to be honest, unless you have to. Yeah, it's kind of sad, actually, because obviously the game itself, those remasters from the PS4, is it? So I don't really think it should be running this poorly on what is still a decently powerful graphics card. So I'm just going to have to put this down to poor optimization, to be honest, which isn't really a surprise with this game. But anyway, let's check out our next graphics card. So, just for the first game, again, I've included Fortnite. I know it really isn't a comparison point on the VRAM side of things for these cards, but for the GTX 1060 6GB that you're seeing here, you can see that the performance is pretty similar to the RX 570 we had before. So in the later games, I guess you could kind of take this card as what the RX 570 is with a bit more VRAM. So here in Fortnite, very similar performance, and to be honest, I don't really need to ramble on much more about this game. It's using just over 3GB of VRAM. This does increase as you play through more of the game, but yeah, you're never really going to hit 6GB VRAM limit, especially not running at 1080p competitive settings like we are here. So yeah, just compare this to the 570 throughout. I mean, the performance should be roughly similar, so any major increases in frame rate are simply down to the VRAM. So now we have Hogwarts Legacy again. Here we have seen a decent increase in performance, I think, so we're running at the same settings as before, 1080p low, and we're nowhere near the VRAM buffer. We are just at 4GB. So this kind of shows that the RX 570 is literally just got too little VRAM, and that's probably why it's a bit stuttery, especially as you change location. So, to be honest, this game actually gave me hope that the GTX 1066GB wouldn't have any VRAM issues, and to be honest, it kind of holds through for the rest of the titles. So I would say, if you're buying a GTX 1060, definitely don't get the 3GB model, but the 6GB model in 2026 is not going to be VRAM constrained at all. Now, what would be an interesting test, and something that I could possibly do in a future video, would be to take a 6GB card with a bit more power. So if I went and got an RTX 2060, we could see if in games like Last of Us or Hogwarts Legacy, we could hit the VRAM limit there, because obviously the 20 series cards were quite a bit more powerful, especially the 2060 versus the 1060. And if you enable ray tracing and DLSS, it'll be interesting to see the sort of differences between the two cards, considering they have the same level of VRAM. So yeah, I think one of the most intensive things you can pretty much do in Hogwarts Legacy is running around Hogwarts. Here we basically got the highest VRAM usage that I could get out of this card, and this was when we flew into Hogwarts Legacy on the broom and then just ran around the castle. And I think because it probably had some of the old bits of the map that you'd been in previously in the VRAM buffer, we were seeing a bit of higher utilization. So I think we hit 4.3GB of VRAM at some point on the 1060. And yeah. Now you might notice that our 1060 here is running significantly cooler than any of the other cards in this test. And that's simply because it has the cooler from a GTX 1080 Ti. So you might remember a few videos ago we tried to fix a GTX 1080 Ti. That card was not really fixable. So I took the cooler off it, and because they were both the Strix models, the 1060 and the 1080 Ti, I just put the Strix cooler from the 1080 Ti on the 1060, and temperatures dropped by about 10 degrees. So yeah. Anyway, as you've seen, we've moved over to The Last of Us now, and with this game, we do see a boost again in VRAM utilization versus the previous game, Hogwarts Legacy, but it's not too bad. So 5GB of VRAM being used here, and overall a very solid showing. So I think, given the fact The Last of Us has a decent headroom here, obviously we were using 5GB of VRAM and we've got 6, you could safely say that this card is genuinely a contender for a decent budget option, whereby you don't need to worry about running into the VRAM limitation that you might experience on the other cards that we've tested so far. Especially when you consider performance-wise, we've got quite a significant step up here versus the RX 570, and the textures and everything, they just looked a bit better. Probably, again, because the card had enough VRAM to actually load them in correctly. So yeah. Finally, on our game roster, we've got a new one. So Steam had a sale on for Flight Sim 2020, so I thought, oh, why not? I'll pick that up. I did have Game Pass, but after the whole pricing rearrangement thing last year, I just cancelled that. And yeah, so Flight Sim on the GTX 1066GB, again, 1080p low settings, ran pretty well. We were only hovering around 3.7 gigabytes of VRAM, and we actually had quite a decent frame rate here, so you could probably step up to 1080p medium. And in fact, I did. And while there isn't a clip on here, it boosts the VRAM utilization up by about 800 megabytes. So again, 1080p medium on this card is more than playable in Flight Sim 2020. And yeah, I'd say, as a summary for the 1066 gigabyte, it's probably the first card here that is truly not VRAM limited in any title. I'm pretty sure you could play any game at settings whereby the card's going to be giving you a nice 40 or 50 frames per second, and you won't run into any VRAM limitations. Now, obviously, if I bump the settings up to Ultra in Last of Us, you're going to see a significant VRAM limitation there. However, we'll be running at like 18 frames per second. So it's just not really fair on the card, and no one's going to be actually be running it like that. So what's the point in doing that? So I think the way that we've tested today, I'd hope that it gives a balance between being realistic, what you're actually going to be running the games at, versus being somewhat informative over what you should buy and what you shouldn't buy. I definitely think with the 570s and 580s, if you're picking them up, do not get the 4GB models unless there's a significant price reduction on them versus their 8GB counterparts. So yeah, I think that just about summarizes the GTX 1066GB. How about its bigger brother in the GTX 1070 with its 8GB of VRAM? Well, let's take a look at that now. So the final card today that we're looking at is the GTX 1070 8GB. Now, of course, as I think everyone expected here, we're seeing quite a significant bump up in performance. We're running at 1080p high settings, and while in Microsoft Flight Simulator that you're seeing now, our frame rate has reduced a bit, we are using significantly more VRAM. We're hovering around 5GB. It does peak up to about 6GB in some areas, actually, depending on where you fly the plane. But yeah, I think I've bumped the settings up. Obviously, that reduces the comparability of the results versus the 1060 and the 570. But if you've got a 1070 and you can step up to the 80 or 90 pound that they seem to be selling for nowadays, then you're not going to really be wanting to run the games at 1080p low. The card can do a lot more than that. You will also notice that I've dropped Fortnite out of the comparison here. I don't really see the point in including that. It ran perfectly fine on all the 3 previous cards we've tested, so I don't really think there's any point in comparing. So, Flight Sim, solid performance. We did get up to around 6GB of VRAM, which shows that if we were running at 1080p high settings on the GTX 1060, in certain places we probably would have seen quite a bit of stuttering. It does depend on where you're flying. We're in New York here, and obviously that's quite a dense area of the map with quite a lot of things to load in. So yeah, the card's pretty decent here. So again, next game up is Hogwarts Legacy. We've seen this before, similar story. We're at about 6GB of VRAM and 1080p high. Quite similar actually in its VRAM utilization to Flight Sim. So I did pretty much the same thing that we did with the 1060, just flying into the castle, Hogwarts, and well, just walking around for a bit. And we saw peaks up to 6GB of VRAM, just slightly over this in some areas. And yeah, I think another solid showing and another solid reason why an 8GB card, as soon as you step up to above 1060 level performance, is essential. And to be fair, given the fact that 1070 running at 1080p high settings is already quite close to its 8GB limit, it really does become clear why I think the recommendation in 2026 for any new cards is at least 12GB of VRAM. And it's why the RTX 5060 Ti 8GB version and the RX 9060 XT 8GB, they're both really quite poor options. I mean, depending on price. Now, in some countries, there's obviously quite a big disparity with the pricing between the 8GB and 16GB models of those two cards. But given the fact our 1070 here is almost 8GB of VRAM and its performance is significantly worse than the two cards that I mentioned before, I can clearly see why, especially if you're buying new cards, you'd want to get 16GB of VRAM. Future-proofing, and also, I mean, the games we're testing here aren't even like current. They're a couple of years old. So current games, you'd probably be hitting closer to 7 or 7.5GB of VRAM with the 1070. So God knows what it's like with more modern 8GB cards. So again, penultimate game for the 1070, we have Last of Us Part 1. So here the game really is living up to its title as a VRAM hog. 1080p high settings, and we were hitting 6.6GB of VRAM pretty consistently throughout our little run here. So yeah, a pretty big step up over what we were seeing on 1080p low with the GTX 1060 and RX 570. The game was also running, well, 35 frames per second. It was under a 40 frames per second average. So to be honest, in this game, I'd say you could probably drop down to medium settings on this card for a better experience overall. But I guess with a game like this, you don't really need frames per second all that much. It's not really that important, and it is a pretty game. So I'm not sure, to be honest. I might take the high settings over a higher frame rate. Now, I'm going to summarize the video now, I think. So obviously, we said before, the RX 460 is a no-go, especially its 2GB version. I'd say all 2GB cards as of 2026, just write them off. Don't go for them. 4GB with our RX 570 might not be sufficient, but say you go with something like an RX 470 or an R9 280 with 4GB of VRAM, or something slightly older with less performance, that'd be a more interesting conversation. So I wouldn't fully write off all 4GB cards, but specifically with the RX 570 and 580, I'd say 8GB or bust, essentially. Now the GTX 1060 6GB is the sweet spot for 6GB cards. Any more performance, as in any more raw grunt than the 1060, you'd probably want to step up to 8GB, which probably invalidates the RTX 2060 as a decent choice on the second-hand market. And then past that, the GTX 1070 here, obviously, we're probably never going to run that 8GB VRAM buffer on a card that can barely hold 35 frames per second in more demanding modern titles. Now, just as a final comparison, I ran Forza Horizon 4 at 4K high settings on the GTX 1070 here. And to be fair, VRAM-wise, we were only using 5GB of VRAM. So, well, for older titles, around when the card itself came out, it just shows that games have kind of massively increased the level of VRAM they need. And, well, as is expected, I guess, as games get more demanding and they look better. So I'd say past the 1060, 1066GB, 1070 8GB, defo go for. And I think it actually calls into question some of the other 8GB cards, so like RTX 2070, RTX 3070 8GB. As most people are saying these days, they're not really going to be sustainable into the future, especially if you want to turn on ray tracing with the 3070, which can still do it in modern games. So I think overall, anything past a 20 series card is going to need more than 8GB of VRAM. And then anything before the 20 series, so 10 series, 1060 wise, definitely 6GB model all the way. Don't even consider the 3GB one. 1070 8GB, yeah, obviously that'll be fine. 1080 will be interesting. 1080 Ti with its 11GB of VRAM, you're probably not going to hit that either. So overall, I hope this video has been informative for everyone. I'm going to wrap up now. And if you've enjoyed, if you've taken something away from this video, I'd like to ask you to subscribe if you would like to do so. Maybe drop a comment on the video asking if you'd like me to test the VRAM limits of any other graphics cards that I can get my hands on for a decent amount of money. Maybe not like an RTX 5090, that might be a bit out of budget. But yeah, overall, I hope this video has been useful and have a good day.